Now I want to talk just firstly about what we're up against. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but the Tories have started to get a little bit triumphalist, almost, braying as is their wont. And I think what's interesting about this, we can start with the terms that set themselves. And even on those terms, everything we warned about has come to pass. Not that we can take any vindication from that. They said they'd wipe out the deficit. Well, they'd be lucky to get through half. They said they'd pay off the debt. Well, they've added more debt in 4 years than Labour did in 13. They said they'd bring back growth. Well, this is the worst so-called economic recovery, not since the 1980s. Not since the recessions of the 1970s. Not even since the Great Depression of the 1930s. We're now in the longest, worst so-called economic recovery since records began in the whole of these islands. But that's not really the test they set themselves, is it? Because what they've done is they've used this crisis as an opportunity to push policies they always wanted to get away with but did not think otherwise possible. To use this crisis to privatise our National Health Service. Now, they didn't have the guts to put that to the electorate because they knew that the people, of course, would have rejected it. It was Nigel Lawson, a Tory, who said that the closest this country has to a religion is the NHS. If we look not only at the NHS, it's been sold off now to the tax-avoiding private healthcare mates of the Conservative government, like the likes of Care UK, for example, which gave Andrew Lansley, the former Secretary of State for Health, the privatiser-in-chief, £20,000 on the eve of the last election. I think you'd agree that was a pretty damn wise investment on the part of Care UK. But it doesn't end there. They're attacking social security. They're removing what remaining rights working people have right across the nations on this island. They're rolling back the state in a way that Margaret Thatcher could never even have dreamt of. And there's as much sign of a recovery in people's lives as there is a sense of shame on the Tory front bench. At the moment, we have the longest fall in living standards since Queen Victoria sat on the throne of this country in the 1870s. We live in Britain where the majority of people in poverty are in work. They get up in the morning, they slog their guts out, they earn their poverty. We have a situation where 6.5 million people are looking for full-time work that isn't there. Not only people who are unemployed, an army of zero-hour contract workers. It's a return to the Victorian age when dockers marched to the yard and stuck their hands up, hoping to get work. Well, these days, people get text messages at 6 a.m. in the morning telling them they'll get work that day. A record number of people in part-time work who want full-time work. The workfare schemes, which take up huge numbers of people who are supposedly taken off the unemployment figures. And then there's a housing crisis. A housing crisis which both New Labour and the Conservatives are responsible for. 5 million people right across England, Scotland, Wales who are stuck on social housing waiting lists. And how does the government respond? With one of the most cruel and unjust policies ever inflicted on the people of this island since World War II, the bedroom tax. A tax which is imposed on disabled people, forcing them to cough up money they don't have, to downsize to smaller properties that don't even exist. But there are booming industries, let's not overdo it, there are booming industries, like food banks. Now, the whole of Britain now is the 6th richest country on the face of the earth, and apparently the poorest people in society can no longer afford to feed themselves. 500,000 people now dependent on food banks. There's other booming industries, legal loan sharks, rich pickings for vultures circling in austerity Britain. 1 million families dependent each and every month on the likes of Wonga to pay off their rent, their mortgage, to put food on the table, to clothe their kids, to pay off other forms of debt. That's the reality of austerity. But how do they want to get away with it? They want to get away with it with an agenda of fear. What they want to do is they want to turn people's justifiable anger away from those who cause this mess, the people at the top, to people's neighbours down the streets. They say to the low-paid worker whose wages are being slashed, whose tax credits are being slashed by this government, don't turn on your boss, don't turn on the government, turn on the unemployed person next door living it up at your expense. They say to the private sector worker, where pensions have been decimated in the private sector for years, don't be angry with your boss, be angry with the nurse next door whose pension is still intact. And where does it end? It ends with public money spent on vans spray painted with the sorts of slogans that belong on national front posters from the 1980s, sent to proudly mixed communities. It's the politics of divide and rule. You've been mugged, so your less deserving neighbour should be mugged as well. The politics of envy, if you like. Envy your neighbour. Envy the unemployed person, the immigrant. And that's what we've got to fight against. And that's why we need an agenda of hope. Because it strikes me that there's lots of people with anger and fear about a lack of hope that things can be different. And the way we get hope is by showing an alternative. And you'll be discussing many of those alternatives. And of course, in the debate over independence, those policies, of course, have to be at the absolute forefront. But here are the sorts of things we should all be talking about regardless. That we have a situation where the majority of people, as I say, in poverty are in work, where we spend tens of billions of pounds subsidising these wages, that instead we should introduce a living wage on the basis that if you work and get up in the morning, the least that can happen is you can afford to have a pay packet that lets you look after your kids and yourself. That instead of leaving 5 million people on social housing waiting lists, with housing benefit, not lining the pockets of the tenants, lining the pockets of private landlords charging rip-off rents, to not only control those rents, but give councils the power to build housing, creating jobs, stimulating the economy, bringing down the amount we spent on housing benefit. That instead of leaving people on 0-hour contracts, in unemployment, in part-time work when they're looking for full-time work, in a vicious cycle of benefits and unemployment, we have an industrial strategy to create renewable energy jobs, taking on the environmental and the jobs crisis too. That instead of the banks being bailed out by us, the people, they continue, as they ever did, paying off massive bonuses, not lending. That we instead have democratic control of the banks we bailed out, turned into public investment banks to rebuild this shattered economy. That instead of talking about benefit fraud all the time, less than 1% of social security spending, £1.2 billion a year, we talk about the £25 billion lost because the people at the top won't pay their taxes, like Amazon, like Google, like Sir Philip Green. That we change the law so no matter how rich you are, no matter how many smug lawyers and accountants you have, you will pay every penny of tax. That when we have a situation where just the increase in wealth for the top 1,000 people since Lehman Brothers came crashing down is bigger than the entire deficit. That we have proper taxes on wealth and income. That instead of letting the big six energy companies hold millions of people to ransom, making people choose between heating their homes and feeding their kids, that we don't just have a price freeze, we have public ownership of energy under the democratic control of consumers. That instead of being held to ransom by rail barons who we subsidise to the tune of 4 times more than we did in the days of British Rail, that as each franchise expires, we bring them back into public ownership as well. I don't think these are radical ideas. I don't think they're wacky. I don't think they're extreme. If you look at the polls, that's where everybody, right across these nations, that is where they are. That is the mainstream, no matter how much Fleet Street and the political establishment say otherwise. But what I want to say about how we achieve that, we have to look at our traditions. And partly, I think you've all debated that today. I think what should give us hope and an example are Bob Crow and Tony Benn. And I'm sure you've discussed much of that, but I just want to talk quickly about the significance for our struggle. Because in life, they were demonised, and in death, they're patronised for the same reason, to neutralise any threat to the status quo. That these people were dangerous for a reason, because they stood up as part of a broader collective movement against those with wealth and power. If we look at Bob Crow, for example, I spoke about the politics of envy. Well, he stood up against that, didn't he? Because what he said, against this mantra of the RMT, you, the low-paid worker, you're struggling to make ends meet. These RMT members, look how much money they've got. And they have the cheek to go on strike. He said, hang on a minute. Instead of us being dragged down to your level, you should be dragged up to ours, instead of a race to the bottom to drag everybody up. And that's what he fought for. He fought for a collective movement where people from below struggled for their rights. It's the same with Tony Benn. He was a man, again, he said it himself, turned from the most dangerous man in Britain to a national sweetheart in an attempt to destroy what he stood for. But he was a man who, again, stood in that proud tradition, not of great individuals, but of people from below struggling for their rights. And that's what gives us hope. Because everything we have, all the gains and all the rights, were not given to us by the goodwill and generosity of those above. They were won through the struggle and sacrifice of people from below. We think of the Chartists, the world's first working class political movement. We think of the suffragettes, demonised, reviled, locked up, force-fed in their day. If we think of those who fought sexism and racism and homophobia, battened in the streets, hated, reviled, ridiculed. We think of the early trade unionists who fought for the dignity and rights of working people, often facing what seemed overwhelming odds but vindicated by history. If we think of the NHS, the welfare state, workers' rights, everything we have fought for by our mothers, our fathers, our grandmothers, our grandfathers and our ancestors before them. We stand on the shoulders of giants. And it is not for us to let everything they fought for at such cost to themselves be stripped away by a government which didn't even win the election. And that's what gives us hope. Because we look at these examples, we know that going out and struggling isn't just to let off a bit of steam. It's not about glorious defeats. It's about winning. It's about showing it is possible to win. If I think of examples of people winning, I think of the Leeds bin workers who went on strike in 2009 against a Lib Dem Tory coalition that wanted to slash their pay by a third. And they went out in winter, it was freezing cold, and they got on the picket lines every day at 5 a.m. And they won. I think of the electricians who took on Balfour Beatty, one of the great multinational companies, who went on strike, who occupied. And they won as well. And it shows it is possible to win. And no matter when we sometimes disagree on strategy, on the way forward, we know that unlike previous times, when we almost had the luxury to fall out, to do the whole People's Front of Judea act, that this time the stakes are too high. That we have to have a broad movement. A movement not just in Scotland, England and Wales, but on the basis that this is an offensive happening everywhere. An attempt to drive back the gains and rights won by working people across Europe and elsewhere. So whatever happens, we need that principle of solidarity, which I know all of you believe in. But I have no doubt whatsoever that if we stand together, we fight together, we will win this battle together. Thank you.